Dear Lord, once again we have the opportunity to meet freely. Once again we have the opportunity to spend a little bit of time gathering around your word. I pray, Lord, that we would be receptive to the seed of your word and that it would fall on soil, Lord, that is ready. Nothing ever wrong with the seed. It's always the soil that needs to be worked over. And as I always pray, Lord, any error is mine. All glory, all honour is yours. In your name we pray. Amen. So for those of you that weren't here last week, we're moving now on to the second part of the parable of the persistent widow. And last week we had a look at this and we spent a little bit of time actually sort of setting the scene for this, discussing how the parable is actually framed. And so I'm not going to touch into that in much more detail. And I did put out a question about the whole verse that sort of frames part of this, is about where the eagles are gathered or where the vultures are gathered, and the differences in the language around that, depending on how you view it. And afterwards, someone mentioned to me that this could all actually link to a location. And there's actually potential merit in that, I believe. And so I'd encourage you to go away from here and do a bit of a study as to where eagles actually gathered in the ancient Near East. What time of year they actually did gather, because they do actually go off and gather somewhere. And then look at that, at what happened to the Jewish people around the time of the siege of AD 70 in Jerusalem. Look at the time of year that siege started and where the believers in Jesus then fled. Did they flee north, south, east or west? Because if I recall rightly, they actually fled east out towards the Jordan and they sought refuge in the hills and caves. And guess which direction eagles gather? I'll let you work that out. How does this align with where the eagles gather? Well, there could be some really interesting insights there. So I think that view that Jesus was potentially indicating a location is really worth exploring. But if we do that now, we are going to be stuck here for ages and ages and ages on this parable. So I can't get into that. But what I would do is I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that, because I do think that there could be something in it that would have been readily understood by the listeners of the day. They would have picked up on what Jesus said, because we do know from history that the Jewish Christians, or the believers in Jesus, when Jerusalem was sieged, they saw it coming and they did a runner. They remembered the words of Jesus. Other people didn't. So be worth you following up on that. So it's good consideration, well worth a follow-up. But now we're going to re-familiarise ourselves with this little story, which is found only in the book of Luke, chapter 18, and it runs through the first 8 verses. And read it from the New Living Translation. It goes like this. One day, Jesus told his disciples a story to show that they should always pray and never give up. There was a judge in a certain city, he said, who neither feared God nor cared about people. A widow of that city came to him repeatedly, saying, "Give me justice in this dispute with my enemy." The judge ignored her for a while, but finally he said to himself, "I don't fear God or care about people, but this woman is driving me crazy. I'm going to see that she gets justice because she's wearing me out with her constant requests." And then the Lord said, "Learn a lesson from this unjust judge. Even he rendered a just decision in the end. So don't you think God will surely give justice to his chosen people who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will grant justice to them quickly. But when the Son of Man returns, how many will he find on the earth who have faith?" So we managed to cover off verses 1 and 2 last week. And I said that this is one of the few parables that actually sets out right up front what the parable is about in terms of what it's trying to teach. Jesus tells us, always pray and never give up. That is the bottom line up front on this parable. Always pray, never give up. Always pray, never give up. And as this story unfolds, Jesus is going to show how the faith of this widow that we're going to meet is linked to the actions of this widow. Faith and action. Faith and action. They go together like a hand in a glove. Hand in a glove. So that's how they go together. Faith and action. Now, I know that you're probably all still recovering from the shock value of getting into verse 2 last week and how the shock value would have hit you right between the eyes of what was being said there, weren't you? About that judging. I know. The character traits that the judging question, didn't we? We had a look at that, and that would have just stunned you as it would have stunned the original listeners. I get that. And we saw, looking at a number of the scriptures, the type of character that a judge should have, and how these were in stark contrast to the type of character that Jesus is demonstrating that this current judge in the story has. So the character traits that Jesus places on this judge in the parable are totally contrary to the character traits that we should be having up there and seeing in the Tanakh, the Old Testament. So Exodus 18:21 talks about how the type of person that the judges should be, and that's Jethro, and he's the father-in-law of Moses. I think last week I called him the son-in-law of Moses. Moses was his son-in-law. I just made a mistake on reading my notes. So Jethro was the father-in-law of Moses. We also read about how Jehoshaphat laid out his expectation of what a judge should look like, what character traits they should have. And that was in 2 Chronicles 19:5-7. So in general, the expectation was that a judge was someone who was a capable person, someone who was honest, someone who feared God, wouldn't take a bribe, somebody who was a God pleaser, not a man pleaser, somebody who was a person of integrity. But we get into this parable, and right up front there, Jesus goes, yeah, well, look at all of that good stuff. And guess what? This judge isn't any of that. This judge doesn't fear God, and this judge does not care for people. And so the people listening would have gone, oh, that's shocking, just like you guys did last week. Yeah. So they'd have gone, that's shocking. So this judge then, due to the fact that he didn't care about God, that he didn't care about people, he didn't have the attributes to actually fairly preside over any case that was brought before him. Because this is the criteria. And he didn't meet that criteria. So the listeners now know, right up front here, that anything that then follows on, anything that then comes in front of that judge to make a decision on, is going to fall on scales of justice that aren't quite balanced right. Just not going to happen. They're not balanced properly. You could use lots of other terms. The dice was loaded. The scales were rigged. Whatever another analogy you want to use to describe the situation. Whatever followed would fall on the ears of a man who didn't give a monkey's uncle about the individual, or indeed the outcome. Judge really didn't care. I don't care about people. I don't care about God. Can you imagine? You just put yourself back there in the scene. Jesus has introduced this player into this little drama, the judge. And you, as a good student of the Tanakh, you, as a good student of the scriptures, are introduced to him right then and there. And so immediately, judge, you have that expectation, don't you? That this guy will fall in line with what the Tanakh says, what the Old Testament says. Only to have Jesus sitting there go, yeah, but I'm going to shatter that expectation. That's not the way this judge is going to be. I'm going to describe this judge's character like this. He doesn't care about you lot. He doesn't care about people. And he doesn't fear God. You know, all eyes are on Jesus, and they're going, oh, our expectation is right up here. Wait, because you think that you know where someone's coming from, right? That is what you would expect a judge to be like this. And all of a sudden you find yourself up here to go, whoa, free falling. Jesus has put his listeners into a free fall because their expectation isn't met. It's just not met. Right up there, right up front. See, they'd have been straining now to hear how this story is going to go on. They'd have been, wow, this is a shock factor. Can it get any worse? They would be going, can it get any worse? Well, lo and behold, We get to verse 3. A widow of that city came to him repeatedly, saying, "Give me justice in the dispute with my enemy." So it's just got worse. It's just got worse. And I can see that you guys are horrified at the narrative of this now. I can see that you just are absolutely hanging onto your seats going, "Oh my goodness, this has just gone from bad to worse. We've not only started the story like this, Jesus, you've now introduced it. Oh my goodness, hang on guys, roller coaster." Why has it got worse? Because we know that the system is stacked, right? We know that this is rigged by a judge who isn't worth his salt. And now our next character is a widow. A widow. Well, what's the big deal about that? What is the big deal? Well, I think it's actually quite big. I think it's quite big. In contrast to many other societies of the day, Israel was pretty progressive. It was pretty progressive when it put in laws to protect people that were orphans, widows, foreigners. In contrast to what was going on in society around it, Israel was progressive. And the Old Testament specified that widows should not be taken advantage of. And this couldn't be made more explicit than in Exodus 22 to 24. "You must not exploit a widow or an orphan. If you exploit them in any way and they cry out to me, then I will certainly hear their cry. My anger will blaze against you, and I'll kill you with the sword. And then your wives will be widows, and your children fatherless." And the psalmist describes God himself being the father of orphans and the defender of widows. Psalm 68, 4-5. "Sing praises to God and to his name. Sing loud praises to him who rides the clouds. His name is the Lord. Rejoice in his presence. Father to the fatherless, defender of widows. This is God, whose dwelling is holy." So a widow was someone who needed to be looked after by the community, who needed to be wrapped around, to be protected, to be cared for. And remember that back then, as is sometimes the case today, but thankfully not as often, a widow wasn't necessarily an old woman. So don't have this picture in your mind of some old woman who's in her 80s, 90s, 100 with a partner who's now gone. A widow was not necessarily like that. A widow may well have been a young woman who was still in the prime of her life. A young woman in the prime of her life. And so just in that regard alone, she's somebody who could very easily become the prey of unscrupulous and powerful individuals. I'll help you if you want to help me. I'll help you, but you need to do something for me. That kind of thing. And so I wonder, and I've not actually researched this, but I do wonder as I was tracking through this, how many widows turned to prostitution to help themselves out of poverty and to provide for their family? I wonder. Because it seems to me that would have been a natural pathway for some ladies to take in order to protect themselves, in order to provide for their families, in order to put food on the table. You see, I think sometimes we think of prostitution, and often in our mindset we make a judgment on the type of person that's engaged in that sort of lifestyle. But I wonder whether back in the ancient Near East, whether the drivers for finding yourself in that type of lifestyle may have been somewhat different to perhaps the drivers are today, where there's a lot of money in it today for various reasons. But I wonder back then whether it wasn't just a case of just, there's no one to look after me. And I've been driven into this type of lifestyle. Particularly if you're a young woman, I wonder. The fact is that Israel as a society, they'd put rules in place to try and prevent that sort of thing from happening. To try and prevent that becoming a necessity for young women who have found themselves as widows. But I wonder how many were actually failed by society. I wonder how many were actually failed by Israel. Were failed by those who should have been looking out for them. Were let down by those who should have had a good eye on them. to wrap around them, to protect them. You see, it hardly surprises me that through the narrative of the Gospels, Jesus had bundles and bundles of compassion for the prostitutes. He cared for them. And he had little time for the religious institutions that had perhaps failed, the widows and the orphans and even the foreigners, or indeed any group that could be marginalised, victimised by the rich, the powerful and the unscrupulous. So a widow was given a high level of protection in the eyes of God when it came to how she should be looked after in society. High level of protection. Every year, every third year, tithes were to be given to orphans, widows, foreigners, and Levites in order to support them. We read about that in Deuteronomy 26, 12 to 13. Every third year you must offer a special tithe of your crops. In this year of the special tithe, you must give your tithes to the Levites, foreigners, orphans, and widows, so that they'll have enough to eat in your towns. And then you must declare in the presence of the Lord your God, I have taken the sacred gift from my house, and I have given it to the Levites, the foreigners, the orphans, and the widows, just as you commanded me. I have not violated or forgotten any of your commands. And Israel was reminded time after time after time to remember where you have come from. Remember where you have come from. Know what happened to you and don't allow that to happen to other people in the future. Remember what happened to you. Don't allow that same thing to happen to others in the future. Deuteronomy 24, 17 to 18. True justice must be given to foreigners living among you and to orphans, and you must never accept a widow's garment as security for her debt. Always remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God redeemed you from your slavery. That's why I've given you this command. You know, the cloak that the person wore was what they wrapped themselves in at night to keep themselves warm, to keep themselves covered, to keep themselves protected. And that was the last thing that you could take when somebody owed you debt. And God says, actually, never accept a widow's garment. You can't do that to her. You can't do that. It doesn't matter what she owes you. You can't take that final covering from her. You can't do that. Don't forget where you've come from. Don't allow your approach to people to change. Remember where you've come from. Gosh, I wonder if some who come to faith actually remember what they were like before coming to faith. What they were like before coming to faith. Because perhaps if they did, they may not be quite so hard on those who are still on their journey. Some Christians can be way too quick to look down on judgment and condemnation on those who haven't yet met Jesus. And what they forget way too quickly is what their own life was like. What was their own life like before they met Jesus? We don't have to live under condemnation of our past misdemeanors. We don't live under that condemnation. But what we mustn't do is we mustn't forget. This is my view. Because once we forget, we can then view other people with very little compassion or very little grace. Don't forget. Don't forget what you were. Don't forget. You know, I listen to some folk talk, and sometimes they'll share with me some very personal details of their life. What they think, thoughts that they're struggling with, what they've done, actions that they've carried out. And they can be really distraught about that. And I don't want to minimise any of those positions in a person's life. But you know, as I listen to people and I run their commentary in parallel to mine, to my life, to my failings, to my misdemeanours. And I think to myself, you know what, mate? If God has shown me grace for the cluster that my life has been, he can certainly sort out your trivial little matters here, because we're not on the same tracks. We're not on the same tracks. That isn't to undermine what somebody else holds as a high concern in their own mind, but it is recognising how gracious God is, how gracious he is, and how willing he is to do business with us. If he can show me grace, he can show anyone grace. And if you remember what you were like, what you think in your private thoughts, then you should cut slack. You should cut slack. I think it's really important to remember that whenever we are chatting to someone who is on their journey, that they have been shown grace by you. They have been shown so much grace by God. We should show them grace based on what we have been through ourselves. We've been shown so much grace, haven't we? Well, I can speak for myself. And I'm going to show a bit of slack for people. Because you know what? It's a journey. It's a journey. I've not arrived there yet. I'm going to continue to drop the ball, and I'm going to continue to muck things up, and I'm going to continue to get things wrong. And I'm not going to look at somebody else's life and go, you're a terrible person, you shouldn't be doing this. Mate, I can't do that. I can't do that. The Israelites were called to remember where they had come from. They'd come from a life of slavery and a life of bondage. And we too should remember the things that have enslaved us. What things in your life have you held onto? Or what things in your life have held you in bondage? Drink, drugs, sex, anger, violence, jealousy, bitterness. All these things are slave drivers over your own life. And remember what you were delivered from. And so cut folks slack, especially if they struggle in those same areas. Cut people slack. So the Old Testament gives us lots of examples of how a widow should be treated. And the listeners to Jesus knew this. They knew this. And Luke even introduces us to the prophetess Anna, doesn't he? Right at the beginning there, who spoke over Jesus when she saw him, when he was brought out, and after, I think, Simeon had seen him. He'd been born, and then what does she do? She goes out, doesn't she? She goes out to tell everyone about him. She goes and tells everyone about him. I reckon she's probably one of the first evangelists, isn't she? Prophetess Anna. She goes out and tells everyone about Jesus. And then in Luke 7:12-13, Jesus shows mercy to the widow of Nain following the death of her only son. A funeral procession, this is found in Luke 7:12-13. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. And the young man who had died was a widow's only son. And a large crowd from the village was with her. And when the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. Don't cry, he said. He looks at this widow and his heart is overflowing with compassion for this woman. Not only was she a widow, but she'd now lost her only son, which left her socially alone and potentially prey to unscrupulous individuals. And Jesus' heart overflows with compassion for her. I wonder how often our hearts overflow with compassion for anyone. Perhaps except for ourselves. I wonder. Later in Luke 21, Jesus points out a widow and he cites her as a model of generosity in comparison to the rich folk who've dropping their offerings into the collection box. Luke 21, 1-4, while Jesus was in the temple, he watched the rich people dropping their gifts in the collection box. And then a poor widow came by and dropped in 2 small coins. I tell you the truth, Jesus said. This poor widow has given more than all the rest of them, for they've given a tiny part of their surplus. But she, poor as she is, has given everything that she has. And we all recall, don't we, that generosity and righteousness are completely intertwined in Judaic thinking. Generosity and righteousness, sidak, sidaka, they are intertwined. The righteous widow, because she's been generous. The unrighteous rich folk, because they actually may have given, but they weren't generous. They just gave tiny parts of what they had left over. She gave all. She gave all. And Jesus also threw out a stark warning to religious leaders in society about their conduct with widows and how those in leadership were ripping these women off. Luke 20, 46 to 47. Beware of those teachers of religious law, for they like to parade around in flowing robes and love to receive respectful greetings as they walk in the marketplaces, and how they love the seats of honour in the synagogues and the head table at the banquets. Yet they shamelessly cheat widows out of their property. And then they pretend to be pious by making long prayers in public. And because of this, they will be severely punished. Not because of the long prayers in public or pretending to be pious, but because they cheat widows. That's why they're going to be punished. You see, a Jewish widow had the right to receive financial maintenance from her husband's estate. But it seems that some in these religious institutions weren't actually doing this. What they were doing is they were ripping them off. They were cheating them from their financial property rights, from their financial benefits. Everything that should have flowed to them was being ripped off by the religious institutions. And if it's not enough for us to understand how this regard for widows has tracked through the Old Testament right up to the time of Jesus, then it's something that was also recognised and continued on by the early church. The book of Acts tells us that widows were fed, Acts 6, 1 to 3. It would appear that back at the time that Jewish widows were being fed better than Gentile widows. So there's a bit of a disagreement that went on there. We actually need to treat people like for like. Nonetheless, they are all being fed. They were being looked after. The believer in Joppa, a woman by the name of Dorcas, she turned her skills to making coats and clothes for the widows. Acts 9:39. The room was filled with widows who were weeping and showing him the coats and other clothes that Dorcas had made for them. And you know what Peter did, don't we? Brought her back. And if you were to take a look at the start of 1 Timothy 5, you'd see that Paul instigates in that chapter a whole number of areas specifically looking at widows in the church. And the brother of James knows that in his view, looking out for widows is paramount in following the faith. James 1:27, pure and genuine religion in the sight of God the Father means caring for orphans and widows in their distress and refusing to let the world corrupt you. So you get the picture. We've got an unrighteous judge and we've got a widow. Jesus is setting this little drama up to play out here, right? Stacked up against this widow, coming against this loaded dice in the form of the judge, who demonstrates absolutely none of the characteristics that a biblical judge should have. None whatsoever. And so this woman, she comes to him repeatedly. She comes to him repeatedly. This is a fascinating Greek word. It means repeatedly. It means that she comes to him repeatedly. Back again and again and again and again. She kept on coming numerous occasions. I don't know if you've ever had a salesperson turn up on the door day after day after day. I guess it probably doesn't happen as much now as it used to back in the day when I was a youngster and growing up as a young lad. But there were so many times that these salespeople would come up and they'd have things to sell and they'd bang on the door and no, thank you very much. But there are only so many times that my mother would say, no, thank you, and close the door on them, because eventually what she'd do, she'd be worn down by this. And then what she'd do is she'd look for the cheapest possible thing to buy it just so that the salesperson would get out of her sight and she could close the door. I'd like to sell you this. No, thank you. I'd like to sell you this. No, thank you. I'd like to sell you this. No, thank you. I'd like to sell you this. No, thank you. I'd like to... How many more times? Yes, I'll buy it. Oh, give me the lot. Just don't knock on my door anymore. We do that, don't we? We do it in families. Mum, Dad, can I have? Mum, Dad, can I have? No. 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 Mum, Dad, yes, just stop asking. It happens, doesn't it? Doesn't it? I think it does. Maybe not in everybody's life. The widow was persistent. She was persistent, and her request was for justice in a dispute that she had. A request for justice should have been dealt with much sooner, right? Here's the issue. It's lodged as a problem, needing resolution, and the courts decide on it, and then they deliver justice. Or at least that's how it should work. She was looking for vindication. She was looking for protection. She was looking for defending through this legal system that was in place to offer all those things for her. Defence, protection, vindication. But clearly after the first time, after the second time, after the third time, after multiple attempts, justice wasn't being delivered. I find it interesting that she's seeking justice in dispute from an enemy. The Greek word is antidikos, and it means an opponent. It means an opponent in a suit of law. It means an adversary or an enemy. It's found 4 times in the New Testament. Matthew 5:25. When you're on your way to court with your adversary, antidikos, settle your differences quickly. Luke 12:58. When you're on the way to court with your accuser, antidikos, try to settle the matter before you get there. Here in Luke 18:3, and also it's used in 1 Peter 5 verse 8, where Peter uses it linked to the devil. Stay alert. Watch out for your great enemy, antidikos, the devil. He prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Adversary, accuser, enemy, all the ways of describing the character of one who was coming against her. You see, in life we often face people who play that type of role, don't we? I know that's been true of my own life, and I've got no doubt that it's true in many of your lives. Having someone who is pressing down on you, not treating you right, someone who is not acting with integrity towards you, someone who is not acting with honesty towards you, whether it's been in a personal relationship or whether it's been in a workplace relationship. You know, it's a horrible thing. Even in this society, that's a horrible position to find yourself in. But even this society, the effects are probably limited in terms of the social standing that it has on you. If somebody's nasty to you at work, it doesn't really affect your social standing, does it? Not really. If somebody's nasty to you in the family, it doesn't really affect your social standing. But back then it would have been dreadful. It would have been dreadful for this woman. But she doesn't give up. She doesn't give up. She doesn't have any social standing. She isn't facing an honest judge. But what she does have is that. She has persistence. She has persistence. In spite of how the deck is stacked against her, she doesn't give up. She keeps on keeping on. And I think that's something that we should be looking to build into our own lives, shouldn't we? Don't give up. Many years ago now, as you will see from this picture, I was sent away on a course with the Special Forces and with some of our intelligence people. It was reckoned on being the toughest course that was on offer at the time. I'm sure that other courses now have that sort of title and credit linked to them. And my good friend, while I was away, told my wife that I wouldn't be able to do this and that I'd be home within the week. And her response to him was, "You don't know my husband. He won't give up. He won't give up." My friend was nearly right, because I could easily have tossed that in within the first few days, let alone the first week. I could have, and there were others that did. But I didn't. I didn't give up. Why? Certainly not because I'm anything special. But I just refused to give up. I refused to give up. Never, ever give up. Whatever it is that you're facing, look at the persistent approach of this widow. Even though the odds were stacked against her, she kept on. She kept on. And we see the value of this type of persistence, even as we just look back through history, in our own lifetime. On October the 29th, 1941, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed pupils at Harrow School, and he noted this: "Never give in. Never give in. Never, 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 never. In nothing great or small, large or petty, never give in, except to convictions of honour and good sense. Never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. Never give up. Never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. This could have been the anthem call of that widow. This could have been the anthem call from her. And in not giving up and in not giving in, her bold tenacity, the Jews would call it chutzpah. She had chutzpah. She had chutzpah. It links her with the great heroes of the past. And I'm thinking here particularly of Moses. Moses in the incident with the golden calf. How Moses then fronts up to God following that incident. And he implores God not to destroy the people. You read about that in Exodus 32. But what's really interesting with that is how the rabbis saw that passage. Because it shocked the rabbis. It shocked them. Rabbi Abahu talks about the strong will of Moses and the boldness that he had with how he implored God by explaining that biblical passage like this. If it was not explicitly written, it would be impossible to say such a thing. This teaches that Moses took hold of the Holy One, blessed be he, like a man who seizes his fellow by his garment and said before him, Sovereign of the universe, I will not let you go until you forgive and pardon them. The picture that this conjures up in the Jewish thinking was Moses grabbing God by his clothes and shaking, I'm not going to let you go. What a staggering picture to conjure up in your mind in a Jewish religious tradition. A holy God, blessed be he, who's grabbed by a man and not let go until forgiveness is given. But that's persistence for you. Grab it. Don't let go. And this is what we should be doing with our faith. Grabbing hold of it. Grabbing it. Not letting it go. Despite all we see going on around us. Despite all that swirls in the relational pools of our life. We should be grabbing this. Brad Young notes, clearly in the Gospels, sometimes faith is described as bold tenacity. The parables of the contemptible friend and the corrupt judge describe faith as unrelenting determination. But the illustrations press beyond an idea of persistence. They challenge the people to redefine the concept of the divine nature. Grab God. Hang on to him. Tenacity. Strong will. Have some chutzpah, people. Have some chutzpah. Grow something. Never give up. Never give in. Never, never, never. Which brings us into verse 4. And what does the judge do? Well, he ignores her. He ignores her. He ignores her. And he ignores her. And he ignores her. And he ignores her until finally, like that banging door in the wind that drives you mad, well, it certainly does me. I cannot stand the door when it just continually bangs. I have to get up and shut that door. I'll listen to it for a few times, but then it's, no, stop it. Or that creaky gate. Or that annoying fly that's constantly buzzing around you and you're swatting it till eventually you get up and grab the swatter or zap it with the spray. The judge, what does he do? He downs tools. He goes, right, I'm sick of this now. I don't fear God. I don't care about people. But this woman is doing my nut. Look at verse 5. But this woman is driving me crazy. And I'm going to see that she gets justice because she is wearing me out with her constant request. Justice would be delivered. Justice would be delivered for this woman. Not because the judge had had a sudden change of heart. He'd already laid out what his character was in verse 4. He confirmed it. No change of his heart. No change of his attitude. She was just doing his head in. Hello, 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 hello. Yes, shut up. Yeah, you can have what you want. Yes, yes. Just get out of my face. She was doing his head in. Once this judgment was out of the way, he'd still be a judge who didn't fear God. He'd still be a judge who didn't care about people. But this woman, as the New Living Translation puts it, was driving him crazy. And I actually really like the way that Jesus describes this for us, because the wearing me out in the Greek is this: huperpiezo. Huperpiezo. And it means to beat black and blue. It means to smite so as to cause bruises and livid spots. This is actually a boxing term. This is a boxing term for giving somebody a black eye. Huperpiezo. The way that this woman was coming up at the judge was like a boxer in the ring coming at the opponent. 1, 2, uppercut, whoa, left hook, get him in there, smack him in the eye, hyperpiezo, yes mate. And that's what the judge was getting. He was getting whacked by this woman. The judge thought he'd gone 10 rounds with her. And then he's like battered. He's battered black and blue until he gets such a shiner, comes to his senses and he throws a towel in. I give up. And the people listening would be going, "Oh, yeah, go on, widow, you get in there. Give him one. Give him another one. Smack him. Black eye. Hyperpiezo." You didn't need to stand in the long ring with her for any longer. She'd won the bout. She was going to get what she deserved. Justice would be delivered. Not because he was just, but because she had battered him into submission. The widow had battered him into... How radical is that when we're talking about God? The widow battered him into... You know, the people listening to Jesus and those religious leaders on the outside... You know, it's bad enough when I have some people of other Christian denominations who listen to me and they sort of almost point the finger at me going, clearly you are so far off the mark, you know, because you don't follow the religious traditions of this, that and the other. Think about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the experts in the law, all listening to Jesus. And Jesus is talking about this widow. And they're recognising where all this sits in their Tanakh. And Jesus is going, yeah, grab them, punch them, smack them, give them a black eye. That's what it's like with God. No, you can see the toes turning up. You can see the cringe factors coming in. But you know what? Paul uses exactly the same term. Paul uses exactly the same term when he's talking about how he's got to subdue his own nature in order to live a holy life. 1 Corinthians 9, 26 to 27. So I run with purpose in every step. I am not just shadow boxing. I discipline. Hupopiadzo. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should do. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I myself might be disqualified. You know, this widow, she had clear purpose for her cause. Her faith was linked to her persistent actions. Paul had clear purpose for every single step of his life. His faith was linked to clear actions that resulted in him disciplining himself to bring it all under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And I think that that is where we need to focus. There are many things that perhaps we can give up on, we can quit on, we can walk away from, when perhaps what we should be doing is digging in. Sometimes I think we lack the depth of character to keep us pushing on and pushing on. It could be in our relationships with our family. It could be in our workplace. It could be in our own time that we spend with Jesus and his people. But we must never, ever give up. We must never, ever give in. And we must persist in what we are looking to achieve. And when we do, we will reap the best outcome from it. We will. We must be willing to get in there and hoopa piazzo, give things a right good crack, and leave it with a black eye. Our faith is not passive. Our faith is not passive. And we're called to live it out through the ups and through the downs of life. No matter what we need, or no matter what we face, no matter what we do, no matter what, we need to be persistent. Whatever the situation is. And we need to pummel it. And we need to beat it black, and we need to beat it blue until we get the outcome. And if we actually apply that principle to our walk with Jesus, in our approach to him in prayer, because this is what this parable's about, prayer. If we grab God by the lapels, like Moses did, or if we shake him, and if we figuratively, we beat him until he's black and blue, This is the sort of passion, this is the sort of drive that God will honour and God will answer. It's having that passion, it's having that fight. There's that saying, isn't there? It's not the size of the dog in the fight, it's the size of the fight in the dog. We need to be a people who have got fight in us, who are willing to wrestle with God, who are willing to get stuck into him. And I would encourage you to wrestle with God. I would encourage you to get serious with him. And I would encourage you not to give up, because he will deliver justice in every area of your life. Because unlike the character of the judge in this parable, God is just in all of his dealings. He's just in all of his dealings. And as we move from the end of that little parable into that next verse, Jesus then starts to wrap it all up. But I am going to leave it here for now, because I've spoken for long enough and we got that out of the way. But don't give up. Be persistent in what you're doing. Wrestle with God. He can cope with it. Get serious with him. He likes that. And the results will follow. I'm convinced of it. So bless you, church. Hopefully we'll try and wrap this up next week. All going well. Let's just pray. Dear Lord, I just want to thank you once again for your word. I thank you for the beauty of your word. I thank you, Lord, that you were a real person who told real stories that would have had your listeners on the edge of their seat, Lord. That you used language that would have shocked people. That you used situations that would have moved people out of their comfort zone. Thank you that you were a real man, and that you still are a real man. And thank you that you have given us the opportunity to step back into relationship with this great spirit that we call God the Father. I pray, Lord, for your blessing on your people. I pray for your blessing on the families that are represented here. And I pray too, Lord, that you would be with those who are absent from us for whatever reason today. Go with us, I pray, Lord. May we honour you. May we wear you well. And may we wrestle with you in the things that we really need to wrestle you with in order to get the outcome that is going to be best. Because you are just. In your name we pray. Amen.